Well, this is the last time this season where we are going to have full slate of MLS midweek action, as we are going to have 13 games with 2 of them taking place tomorrow and 11 that is going to be taking place on Wednesday, although there's no guarantee. The fact that all 13 of these games are going to be played and finished by the end of Wednesday night, and that I've already heard news today that one of these MLS team got COVID positive test, and that there could be a situation where one of these games, if not more than one of these games, that could be postponed for this weekend. We're also getting to a point where, as we get closer to decision day and as we wind down the regular season, when we have these games that is being postponed, it's getting tougher and tougher to find times to actually reschedule, and that I hope the worst case scenario that we might have to deal with as we get into decision day is that leading up to that, there might be a couple of teams, or maybe at best one team get tested positive for COVID-19, and that their games on decision day has to be postponed to another day. And if that game has a lot of playoff implication, boy oh boy, there's going to be a lot of teams that's going to be biting their finger now, and in some way it's kind of a little bit unfair, the fact that those games are going to be postponed to another day because of that situation. But, we're living in a world where everything is just not normal anymore, and there's definitely a lot of unfairness. But let's just hope for once we can get to decision day and that we're not going to have any of those games that is going to be postponed. Or as we get into these last couple of match week leading up to decision day, there's going to be no more game that is going to be postponed, and all the games that is going to be made up because of a game that was postponed earlier is also going to be played. But that being said, after I kind of get into my 2-minute spiel about my concern, the fact that some of these games can get postponed, let's actually start talking about the first game of this 13-game action, which is Montreal versus Nashville, as this game is going to kick off tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Montreal is currently 7-2-11, while Nashville is 6-7-6, and Montreal took a big hit in terms of their playoff aspiration after that 3-1 loss against NYCFC on the road, and now they are currently in 9th place in the East and just 2 points above the red line. Well, for Nashville, they're currently 8th in the East, and they're 4 points above the red line right now. But obviously, I think if they can get maybe 1 or 2 more wins, they should be able to lock up their playoff spot and only become the 5th expansion team to ever make it to the playoffs in their inaugural season. Now, for the remaining games, and this is another thing that I'm going to do for this preview, where I'm going to also look at the remaining games of every single team and how that could really be something that be considered in terms of how the playoff picture would look. But for Montreal, their last 2 games is going to be a game at home against Orlando, and then their decision day game is going to be a road game against DC United. And judging how things have gone with Montreal and DC getting closer and closer to be together in the standing wise, that could be also a game that could really determine who, of course, would make it to the playoffs and who potentially could be out of the playoffs. Now, for Nashville, they have 3 games left, with them playing against Chicago at home in the next game. Then they play against Dallas at home before finishing the season on decision day, playing Orlando City on the road. So it's kind of a relatively easy schedule, although there are definitely a couple of teams that they are going to be playing, especially their next game against Chicago is going to be very big, because that could be a game where if they are able to get points against Montreal, that could be a game that could really get a chance for them to punch their tickets to the playoffs. And know that Nashville fans would want this team to try to punch their ticket to the playoffs, and the fact that they definitely deserved it with the way that they've been playing this season and how they have just exceed every expectation. This is definitely a team that look like it is going to be playoff bound, but obviously they still need to finish business. And on the road against Montreal, it is, I wouldn't say it's a winnable game for Nashville, because Montreal is also going to be desperate, and they're going to see this game as an opportunity to try to bounce back after that loss against NYCFC. But knowing the fact that Nashville has been very good recently, and actually on a 4-game unbeaten run, this could be a very interesting kind of game, and that whoever wins this game will definitely have a big edge in terms of them getting closer, punching their tickets to the playoffs in the Eastern Conference. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is the Vancouver Whitecaps against the Seattle Sounders, also known as the Forgotten Cascadia Derby, as the Whitecaps are going to be playing this game at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. The Whitecaps, believe it or not, they're the only team in the league to have yet to draw a game this season, and they might actually become the first team in league history to not record a single draw in a season. I mean, I know this is a shortened season, so maybe that is the reason why they're going to make history, but at the same time, it's not a shortened season in a way that the Whitecaps only play 10 or 15 games. They're going to be playing 23 games, and they could be in a situation where they would not draw any of their games whatsoever. But at the same time, I think even though they'll be a little bit frustrated, the fact that sometimes, some of these games that they probably should have draw when they're in a losing position, and they could of course pick up extra points, they'll also kind of be glad that sometimes they were able to win games and aren't able to draw points that led to draw. Actually, what the heck am I even saying? Just ignore what I said about that. Was just kind of weird way to phrase that. But moving further away from that, they're playing against a Sounders team that is 9-5-4, and this game is going to kick off at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. Vancouver, of course, are currently in 7th in the West after a big win against the Quakes, and they're currently 2 points above the red line, while the Sounders, they fall to 2nd in the Western Conference, 1 point behind SKC, who currently have the top spot in the Western Conference. For the Whitecaps, so here's where it gets interesting for the Whitecaps. They're actually not going to have a road game for the remaining of the regular season, because their very next game, they're playing against the Timbers on the road. But as I said before earlier this season, since Vancouver is choosing Providence Park as their neutral ground, and we're always going to have these kind of weird circumstances that Vancouver is playing Portland, even though technically it's not a road game for Vancouver in this season circumstances, and they're kind of playing at home. It just gets a little bit weird in terms of that. And then after that, they play against the Galaxy at home and at Providence Park. So yeah, I mean, they're going to be playing their home game, and that might be a edge that they might have in terms of making the playoffs, knowing the fact that they don't have to worry about traveling anymore, and that these next two games are definitely, one of them are going to be really tough, but the other one is definitely a winnable game. Now for the Sounders, they of course will be going on the road to play against the Rapids, and they're going to be so far the only team out of all those teams that still have to play Colorado as one of the game that got postponed it because of the Rapids having the COVID outbreak and having all those games that has been postponed. Well, they're going to be one of those lucky teams that are able to make up the game against the Rapids. But after that, they play against the Galaxy on the road before finishing the season against the San Jose Earthquakes at home on decision day. Now, obviously, the Sounders, they would love to try to get a win in this game. I still haven't heard any word about whether or not if Rudy Diaz is back with this team. Remember, Rudy Diaz was part of that Peru team that seems to have a COVID outbreak that was going on with the national team, so that's why he hasn't really made it back to the Seattle Sounders compared to what other teams when they had guys that is missing action because of international duty, and that this weekend they were able to come back to their club team. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not if he's going to be back with the Sounders for these last couple of games. And in some way, it's going to be important that he gets back to this team, because in the last couple of games of how much they struggle on the attack, you can clearly see that they dearly miss Rudy Diaz in that number 9 spot. But either way, I think this could be an interesting one, and I want to say that Vancouver might get a chance to win this game, because anytime I say they get a surprising win, they end up to get all 3 points. But yeah, the Sounders, they are also going to be hungry and trying to get themselves back in that top spot in the Western Conference after they hold on for a very long time before losing it this weekend. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is going to be the Redbulls versus the New England Revolution. So the Redbulls are 7-5-8, and the Revs are 7-8-5, and this game kicks off at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Both of these teams are only 3 points separated from each other, with the Redbulls currently in 6th place and New England currently in the... Oh, actually, that is actually wrong. The Redbulls is actually in 7, and New England is in 6. There we go. Just fix it like that. But either way, both of these teams are in a very good position where if they can able to get a win, and depending on what those teams that is on the bubble of the playoff spot, and depending on what Chicago and Miami does this weekend, they could potentially clinch their spot for the playoffs if they can get a win in this game. Now, for the Redbulls, the remaining game, they got the Hudson River Derby in the next game against NYCFC before finishing off the season against TFC at home. While for New England, they got DC United at home in the next game before finishing off the season against the Philadelphia Union, and that's definitely a murderous kind of schedule for New England, but at the same time could be maybe a chance to kind of really test themselves against some decent team. I mean, I know some would say, well, DC is not a decent team. Why are you saying that they are a hard team to play for New England? Well, first of all, this is a home game for the Revs, which you know what that means when it's the Revs are playing at home. They always tend to struggle no matter what opponent it is. And then they're also going to be facing a DC team that's going to be really desperate. And it looked like this is one of those teams that is making a very late playoff push to try to get themselves above the red line. And then, of course, the final week playing against the Union, where that game, you know, depending on what certain circumstances where the Union might be able to clinch the Supporters' Shield by then, that is going to be a really tough one, knowing the fact that if the Union doesn't clinch the Supporters' Shield by then, they also would want to get a win over New England so that they can, of course, get that Supporters' Shield spot that they're fighting against TFC for that spot in the Eastern Conference, and also for the Supporters' Shield. So, yeah, that is definitely a tough schedule for New England to face, but either way, as I said, both of these teams are in very good position to make the playoffs, and I think the worst case scenario is that one of these teams might drop down to a position where they could have to play in that play-in round. Did I mention the fact that the Eastern Conference, there is a play-in round? Yeah, so all those teams that is in 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th have to be playing in a play-in round. So this game also could mean a lot where both of these teams are kind of in the bubble, where New England in 6th place, they don't have to play in a play-in round, where the Redbulls are in 7th, where they're going to have to play in the play-in round. Both of these teams will also want to get a win in this, so that not only they can get themselves closer to get into the playoff position, but they also want to avoid have to play in a play-in round by finish in 7th place in the Eastern Conference. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is Cincinnati versus Sporting KC. So, first of all, I want to congratulations to Sporting KC, as they are now the recipient of another free win of the week. So last week they were the recipient against the Rapids, and I didn't want to say that was the case with respect to the fact that I want to welcome the Colorado Rapids back into MLS after being out for a month, but that was also a game you knew that SKC was probably going to win. Well, they have another chance to get another 3 points against the Cincinnati team that I really think even though they're not mathematically eliminated right now, they look like they're down and out. I mean, that last game against Minnesota, if that did not really kind of a soul-crushing loss that they suffer in the last minute of the game, I don't know what is. And to be fair, I will say this, something that I didn't mention in the review of the Minnesota versus Cincinnati game is that I thought Cincy probably have a right in terms of talking about the fact that it shouldn't haven't been a corner for Minnesota, and that ball actually didn't win out one of the Cincinnati players. So in some way, Minnesota got lucky. The fact that they were able to get a corner, that probably isn't the case. But I would also argue, well, yeah, but you still had to defend the corner, and you cannot give up late goals like that. Speaking of elimination, Cincinnati, they could be the first team to be eliminated in the playoffs, and if they, of course, are going to lose this game, and if Miami and Chicago is going to win they will be the first team to be eliminated in the playoffs. Whereas for Sport KC, they're top of the West right now with a 1-point lead over Seattle and Portland. And looking at their last 2 games, they're definitely winnable games, where in the next one they're going to be playing against Minnesota while going on the road against RSL. While for Cincinnati, they got Atlanta next before playing against Miami on the road. And although those are 2 teams that they are kind of fighting to try to get into the playoffs position, like I said, since Cincinnati is just so far behind, they're 5 points behind the red line with just 3 games left this season, and knowing the fact that they're about to play an SKC team that they're going to try to get all 3 points so that they can make sure themselves finish at the top of the Western Conference. This looked like it's going to be a loss for FC Cincinnati, and that I really think that last game against Minnesota has really just killed the spirit of this team and killed any last kind of hope the fact that Cincinnati can have in terms of making the playoffs this year. So, yeah, no doubt SKC is going to win this one, and we could be heading into the first at the end of this midweek action where the first team got eliminated in the playoffs. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is Orlando versus Atlanta. So, you know how earlier I said one of these teams actually got positive COVID-19, or they actually got positive COVID test announced this morning? Well, that team is Atlanta United, as it was confirmed today that they had a player or a staff member that got tested positive for COVID-19, and now there could be a question whether or not if this game is going to take place or not. And it's going to be a shame, the fact that this game is maybe going to be called off, because this is going to be a national televised game on FS1, as this game is going to kick off at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. Orlando is currently 8-3, while Atlanta is 5-4-11. And in some way, this game also means a lot to both teams, not just because of the rivalry standpoint, but there could be a lot of stake in terms of playoffs and also the seeding. And for Orlando, they are winless in the last 4 games, and things have definitely started to kind of unravel a little bit for Oscar Pereira team, and that, this is probably the worst time when you're starting to kind of unravel a little bit and go on a winless run as we get closer into the playoffs. So hopefully this is a game that they want to win, not only for them to try to maintain that 4 spot or maybe get a little bit higher in terms of the seeding, but they got to also be careful of the fact that all of a sudden NYCFC has started to catching up to them, and they're only 2 points behind them, and that they're actually sitting in the last spot in terms of a playoff position, where at least a team is going to be playing at home for the first round of the playoffs. Now for Atlanta, they're currently in 12th in the Eastern Conference, and they're 2 points below the red line, and that they're certainly are trying to get this win to try to redeem themselves after what happened in the last game, where they took such a heartbreaking loss against DC United, in a game where they thought that they got a point out of that game, and then they just conceded in the 93rd minute. Now looking at Atlanta's schedule, they got FC Cincinnati at home and Columbus on the road. Those are definitely 2 teams that is not, I mean, the FC Cincinnati resort might be a pretty easy resort, but the Columbus resort might not be, although depending on whether or not if Columbus might be resting their guys by the time that game is taking place. While for Orlando, they still have to play against Montreal on the road before also playing against Columbus at home and finish off the season on decision day against Nashville SC. But either way, this game really means a lot for both of these teams for different reasons. For Orlando, they want to snap out of this winless run and don't want to continue this downward spiral as we get closer to the playoffs. And for Atlanta, they're fighting for their playoff lives, and they really need to try to snap out of themselves that also are in a winless run right now, and in a goal drought that they are in right now, where they don't snap out of this goal drought that they are in, they could potentially have their playoff chances go up in smoke. But moving on now into the last game on this board is going to be the Union and the Chicago Fire. So the Union is currently 12-5-3, while the Chicago Fire is 5-6-8, and this game kicks off at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. Union probably is going to be feeling incredibly high coming into this game with the way that after they of course won 5-0 against TFC, and that they have all the momentum heading into this game, and that they also are leading the Supporters' Shield standing and are 5 games unbeaten coming into this one. But here's the thing that the Union's got to be a little bit careful with, because the next game that they're playing in is against Columbus on the road, and that could really be a very big game, and probably a game that the Union are going to be looking ahead and knowing that this is a game that they're going to try to redeem themselves after they suffer a 1-0 loss against Columbus. And that, in other words, this could be a trap game for the Union, because they're about to play against a Chicago team that is currently tied with Miami, but they're currently below the red line because Miami technically have the tiebreaker over them in wins, and that Miami is only the last playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. But the good news for the Chicago Fire is that they do have a game in hand over for Inter Miami, so technically they still kind of control their own destinies in terms of them making the playoffs. Although this is definitely going to be a tough one against the Union side. That, again, I really think this could potentially be a trap game, and that they could easily overlook Chicago and just kind of look ahead against Columbus. And they got to also realize that since they are battling for Toronto for the Supporters' Shield, and they're literally deadlocked at the standing in terms of points wise, and that the Union only have the advantage on goal differential, they cannot afford to basically afford to drop points against teams that they might of course overlook, and that they might drop points in games that is kind of known as a trap game that the Union are in this one. But besides the Columbus game that they have to play next, they of course finish off the season against New England at home, while for Chicago they have to go on the road against Nashville next before going on the road against Minnesota and playing at home against NYCFC to wrap up their regular season. And those are definitely not easy games whatsoever, especially how Chicago has really struggled this season on the road, and that those are also a couple of teams that don't really struggle at home and are teams that is fighting for playoffs too, or in some case for playoff seeding. Yeah, that could be a really, really tough schedule, even though Chicago is still control their own destiny. But either way, this should be a very interesting one. We'll see whether or not if the Union is going to keep up that intensity. I mean, my fear, again, not only the fact that this is a trap game for the Union, but they could always have that let down with the way that after feeling so hot in that game and just completely ripping TFC to shred, it gets really tough to try to get back to that same intensity against a lesser opponent team that they're going to be facing, the Chicago Fire, in this one. But that being said, I am now going to switch the boards and going to look at the last 7 games, and also switching the boards for the second time to look at the next 6 games that is going to be taking place in this midweek action. But yeah, moving on in terms of the next match is Toronto against NYCFC. So TFC is currently 12-5-3, while NYCFC is 9-3-8. This game kicks off at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. Toronto is currently second in the East and tied with Philly at the top spot and also in the Supporters' Shield standings. While for NYCFC, they can actually become the next team in the Eastern Conference to clinch their playoff spot if they can get a win in this game against Toronto. Now, for TFC, in terms of their last 2 games, they got Inter Miami next at home before finishing off the season against the Redbulls at Red Bull Arena. Speaking of the Redbulls, that's what the next game that NYCFC is going to be playing in the Hudson River Derby before finishing off the season against the Chicago Fire on the road. And that, even if NYCFC don't win this game, I believe if Chicago or Miami does not able to get wins in their game, they will also punch their spot in terms of heading into the playoffs this season. But this is definitely a good test for NYCFC to really test themselves against the TFC side. That, yeah, this is going to be interesting to see how they respond after that 5-0 thrashing, and I'm interested to see if some of their attacking power is going to be back in this game, because in the last one they basically not only had no defense whatsoever, but they just had no attacking power whatsoever, with the likes of Akinola, Altidore, and Piatti not available for them. So there definitely going to be hope that they can at least get one of those guys back in this game, because they will really need it against an NYCFC team that are definitely going to be feeling good after they were able to get a 3-1 win against Montreal, and that this could definitely be a good measuring stick in terms of the fact that, well, they are going to make the playoffs, but now it's going to be matter, can this team actually make a deep run, and that this could really be a game that could determine and be a measuring stick that, are they actually Eastern Conference contender, or is this going to be like the old NYCFC team that most likely is going to fold by the time that they get into the second round, and that they still, for whatever reason, cannot find a way to get past the second round of the playoffs. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is going to be DC and Columbus. So DC United, as I mentioned before, they are a team that has definitely been on a resurgence ever since Ben Olsen is no longer their head coach. And because of that resurgence, their record is now 4-6-10, and they're only 3 points below the red line in 13th place in the Eastern Conference. While the Columbus Crew, they currently have a record of 10-5-4, and this game is going to kick off at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, and Columbus is still looking for their first road win this season after they drew in their last game against the Houston Dynamo. Now, for Columbus, this is kind of a little bit of an interesting situation that they're in, because they're currently third in the East, and that they're 6 points behind the Union and TFC for the top spot. So I don't think they're going to have enough of games remain that they can potentially catch up to these two teams, although there are also 5 points above NYCFC in terms of finishing up in the top 4 and at least getting one game at home for the first round of the playoffs. So if you're Caleb Porter, this is kind of an interesting dynamic where you're right in the middle, where you're too far of catching up teams, potentially battling them for the supporter shield, and teams that you might be a little bit too far ahead in terms of dropping out and not having home game this season. So what do you do in this game? Do you decide to maybe rest some of your guys? But I think most likely he's going to play most of his guys, especially some of the guys that is back in this team. Because when you also look at these next couple of games can also be a bit of a measuring stick and could be kind of a preview in terms of the two opponents that Columbus could be facing in the first two round in the playoffs. First, they of course will be playing against the Union next, who that could be an opponent that they could be facing in the second round. Whereas the next one they play against Orlando City, that could be a team that they could be facing in the first round. And then they finish off the season against Atlanta at home. Now for DC, they of course are going to be playing against New England on the road before finishing off the season against Montreal at home. And those two games are definitely winnable games for DC United, alongside with this one where playing against a Columbus team that's still searching for their first road win and have been really struggling this season on the road. You would think that this could be a big opportunity for them to get all 3 points, and that, yes, they are now well and alive and kind of have come back from the dead with the way that they have got a couple of wins and getting this free game unbeaten run going. They got to also be careful to not drop resort and lose some of these games, because if they lose one of these games, and that all of a sudden that they could potentially find themselves 5 or 6 points behind the red line, that also could be a chance where their playoff races go. Like right now, DC, on one hand, they're kind of almost playing a high risk, high reward kind of game, where there is definitely a high reward if they can continue to win these games, they can get back into the playoff race, but they're also playing a high risk game, knowing the fact that if you drop any of these resort and depending on what other team does, they could definitely find themselves out of the playoff race. But certainly, I think DC is going to be favorites, and that I would pick them to win this game. Although, as I said, Columbus is getting some of their guys back, and they're looking to try to get a couple wins for the remaining part of the season, so that they can at least feel a little bit comfortable as they get into the playoffs this season. But now moving on into the next game of this match week is Minnesota versus Colorado. So I want to say the Loons, this is they're awarded the game where they should be able to get all 3 points against a Rapids team that is still back to match fitness. However, the Rapids, since they have already got 90 minutes under the belt, I would think they should be a little bit better coming into this game against the Loons. And that, the Loons, they're currently 7-6-5, while Colorado is 5-4-5. And although they have been unbeaten in the last 5 games, let's be honest, their last five games that they've been playing have been unbeaten because of a little bit luck that they have been involved in terms of team unable to finish and putting their chances away. And also we got some referee decision that kind of gone in favor of us in the last game against FC Cincinnati. And if you want to look in a deeper picture of this team, yeah, this team has really struggled in the last couple of games, and I'm really surprised the fact that they're on this unbeaten run, despite the fact that they have looked nothing like a team that is ready to compete in the playoffs. Now, they are also 1 point behind LAFC for 4th place, and I want to mention that because they're actually only 1 point behind LAFC for that last spot in the playoffs, where they're guaranteed to have a home game in the first round. But like I said before, if they do play against LAFC in the first round, whether it's home or away, I don't think they're going to win that game with the way that they have looked, and especially how good LAFC is starting to become lately. There's just no way in the world, if Minnesota play LAFC either playing at home or away, I just don't see they're going to win this game. Now, for Colorado, they of course lost 4-0 against SKC, but they're still 6th in the Western Conference if we do go, and most likely will be for the points per game ratio to determine the playoff spot in the Western Conference. And while that's still good for the Rapids, they got to be careful because, as I said before with the Rapids, yes, they're still above the red lines if we go points per game ratio, but if you're not going to win games and if you keep dropping points, that point per game ratio is going to continue to go down, and it's going to go down to a point where it doesn't really matter if we do go to a points per game or not. They're probably still going to miss the playoffs. Now, for Minnesota, their next couple of games are actually not that bad. I mean, the next one is probably going to be the toughest game that they have for the remaining of the season against SKC on the road, which most likely is going to be an automatic loss because Minnesota never do well against Sporting KC when they're playing them on the road. But they finish off the season with 2 winnable home games against Chicago and FC Dallas on decision day. While for the Rapids, they of course will be playing against the Sounders, the Timbers on the road, and the Houston Dynamo to finish off in terms of decision day. And we still don't know if there are other games that Colorado is going to still make up for, because even though they are looking to try to make up 2 of what looked like was 4 or 5 games that they missed because of that COVID outbreak, that most likely maybe isn't the case, and hence that's why I've been always mentioning about the fact that the Western Conference could go to a points per game ratio to determine playoffs. But as I said before, for the Rapids, yes, this is tough for them to try to get themselves back to match fitness and realize that they're also kind of running out of games in terms of trying to protect themselves in terms of the points per game ratio to make sure it's enough to get above the red line. But at the same time, I'm very desperate to see that Minnesota does get a win in this game, and that I hope the offense can really improve in these last couple of games, because these last couple of games, the offense has just been very, very sloppy, and I just feel like this is just one of these games. If I just don't want Minnesota to just get all 3 points in this game, but they need to start to kind of look a little bit more convincing to a point where maybe I have some hope in terms of them maybe making a deep playoff run, because really, I know this team is going to make the playoffs. I think they're getting to a point where they should be able to make the playoffs, barring a late collapse that they had in the last 3 games. But at the same time, it's also a point where, well, if that is the case, then, not only the fact that we want to at least secure a home game for the first round of the playoffs, but we got to also look good as we head into the playoffs, because we're not going to be playing these easy teams like Chicago and FC Dallas for the last 2 games of the season, and that we're actually going to be facing against real opponent that is going to be much tougher than the one that we have faced in the last couple of games, and also for the remaining of the schedule. But moving on, in terms of the next match, speaking of FC Dallas, they are going to be playing against Inter Miami, and this is definitely a playoff 6-pointer in terms of playoff implication in both of the conference. For Dallas, they're currently 6-7-5, and they're currently 6th in the Western Conference, but they're only 3 points above the red line right now, while Inter Miami, they're currently owns the last spot in the Eastern Conference in terms of the playoffs, and they have a record of 6-3-11, but they don't control their own destiny because, as I mentioned before, Chicago currently have a game in hand over them, and that if they can win that game and over them, they can of course leapfrog them into the last spot of the playoffs. And this game is going to be kicking off at 8:30 p.m. Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Pacific. For Dallas, their next game is going to be against the Houston Dynamo in the Texas Derby, and that could also be another playoff 6-pointer, depending on if Dallas is going to be getting to a point where they are going to continue to fall down the table, with them being on a winless run lately, or the fact that Houston is getting to a desperation point where if they don't win that game, they could be eliminated in the Western Conference. But then after that, they of course play against Nashville on the road before finishing off the season against Minnesota on the road. So that is definitely not an easy schedule whatsoever. And that if you're a Dallas fan, this is probably a must-win for you, knowing how the fact that, yes, even though they're only 3 points above the red line right now, it doesn't mean the fact that they look comfortable whatsoever. And as I mentioned, with the way that they have been really struggling in these last couple of games, this is probably the worst time that they want to go on a cold run. And that, just looking the remaining schedule that they had, that is a really tough schedule, and a schedule that I expect that Dallas could potentially drop more points. And that since this also is a game at home, and since home form is really the only reason why Dallas is in the playoffs right now, they have to win this one, knowing the fact that these next couple of games, they only have one more home game left this season, and then after that, they're just going to have to say their prayer and hope that their road form will not go badly in those two games against Nashville and Minnesota to finish off the season. Now, for Miami, this also kind of might be a must-win game for them, because when you look at these last two games, one of them is definitely going to be tough because they have to play against TFC and a team that are really looking to try to battle for the Union for the Supporters' Shield standings. And then their very last game is against FC Cincinnati, which that should be a relatively easy game, knowing by then most likely Cincinnati is going to be eliminated from the playoffs. But it also gets to a point where, heading into that last game, could that also be a game where it could be completely meaningless with both teams eliminated in the playoffs, or the fact that Miami is going to be still alive. But either way, I think both of these teams, they're definitely desperate to try to get all 3 points, and that whoever gets 3 points will have a huge hope in terms of the playoff race. And that if I want to mention who needs this 3 points more, it's got to be Dallas. I mean, when they're playing at home, which is real, as I said, that's really the thing that is holding them in terms of making the playoffs this season. If they drop more points at home, if I'm a Dallas fan, I am definitely hitting the panic button in terms of the way that there is most likely the case that they could actually fall out of the playoff race, especially the teams behind them that are started to trying to chase them down and trying to get these last couple of spots in the Western Conference. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is Portland and the LA Galaxy, and I actually made a bit of a mistake here. I wrote Galaxy twice, even in the record here, so I'm just gonna just get my phone here just to quickly look at the schedule. Well, not the schedule, but the standing wise, so I can see the record that the Galaxy had. So the record is actually 5-3-10. There we go. 5-3-10 is the record for the Galaxy. Well, the Timber is coming into this game with a 9-5-5 record. This game kicks off at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific, and it's also going to be a national televised game, as it's going to be on ESPN. Now, Portland is currently third in the West and tied with Seattle for that second spot. Well, technically, I would say they're currently tied with Seattle in the second position, instead of just saying that they're in third in the West. But if you want to go with tiebreakers, Seattle does have the tiebreaker and have a game in hand over the Portland Timbers, while they are also 1 point behind SKC for the top spot of the Western Conference. Now, for the Galaxy, they are kind of in a similar situation as FC Cincinnati is in the Eastern Conference. You know, both of them are dead last in their respective conference. Both of them are really struggling with the way that Galaxy have lost 7 in 8 games, and that both of them are really staring down the barrel in terms of elimination, and that I think coming into this game, if the Galaxy does not win this one, they are most likely going to be very close to being eliminated, if not mathematically eliminated in the playoffs, and become the first team in the Western Conference that's going to be eliminated from the playoffs. Now, for the Portland Timbers, their last 3 games of the season, they play against Vancouver at home before playing against Colorado at home also, but they do finish off the season in that showdown against LAFC on decision day, and something tells me that game could be on national television with the way how big that game, of course, could be. But in terms of the Galaxy, they, of course, play RSL next at home before playing against the Seattle Sounders and finishing off the season against the Vancouver Whitecaps, and that, barring any big miracle that happened for the Galaxy, maybe that Vancouver and Galaxy game could also be a game that determine if either of these team is going to the playoffs. But obviously, I think many people will realize that after that loss that the Galaxy took in the hands of LAFC, not only the fact that that is a crushing loss for the Galaxy, and that was kind of a game where if they would have won that game, they could have been right back into the playoff conversation and have a lot of momentum in. But because they lost that one, and that they are 6 points behind the red line, and that even if we do go to a points per game system, it still doesn't look very kind to them. I'm just going to say, look like the Galaxy might be down and out, and that for the Timbers, they got a big chance to get all 3 points in this game and continue to try to put pressure on both Seattle and SKC in terms of getting the top spot in the Western Conference. But moving on into the last game on this board is going to be LAFC versus the Houston Dynamo. So, you know how last week I talked about how the Dynamo really need to get the 3 points against Columbus, and that not getting 3 points and continue their woeful run of getting 1 win in 11 games might be very damaging to the Dynamo in terms of their playoff chances? Well, this was one of the reasons. Because they're about to play against an LAFC team that not only the fact that they're going to be very confident after that El Tráfico win, and that I believe that's the first time ever that LAFC was able to get an El Tráfico win in the regular season, but they're getting some of their attacking, well, not some, but all their attacking power back with the likes of Diego Rossi, Vela, and Rodriguez. All of them are back in the starting 11 in this team. And that even though this team is currently 4th in the Western Conference and their record is 8-4-7, they're 5 points behind SKC for the top spot. And I kind of want to mention that because I have a feeling there is still a good shot that they could really catch up to that team. And even if they don't catch up to that team and maybe finish in 4th, 3rd, or even 2nd place, believe me, this is definitely not a team that you want to play, and that they are also a team that is looking to win these next couple of games to get their confidence back, and that they're looking to try to head into the playoffs on a hot streak. Now, for the Dynamo, they are currently in 10th in the Western Conference and are 3 points below the red line. And when you look at the last 2 games that they had, they got FC Dallas on the road in the next game, which is, I've already mentioned that could be a playoff 6-pointer. And then the last game of the season, will be playing against the Colorado Rapids. While for LAFC, they're going to be playing against the Quakes Nets before finishing off the season against the Portland Timbers at home. But yeah, those are also 2 games that are winnable games for LAFC, and that, you know, if they can win both of the remaining games, they could definitely have a shot in terms of not just finish in 4th place in the Western Conference, but can really go for that top spot in the Western Conference. Whereas for Houston, you know, when you look at these 2 games, that next game against Dallas is gonna be huge and could be a game where they could be up for elimination. I mean, if they do lose this game, I believe they could find themselves 6 points behind. And you could also say if they lose this game, maybe their hope could potentially be all gone of making the playoffs, because I just think that even if they do stay off elimination in the very next week, there might be not enough time in terms of them heading into the final week against the Colorado Rapids of making the playoffs. And if you're the Dynamo, this season, I know that this year was a year of transition, and that knowing the fact that this was a year that I don't think a lot of Dynamo fans are expect their team to make the playoffs, are you still going to be a little bit disappointed that this team weren't able to make it, and especially how good they were in the first couple of games of Phase 1, and that they almost kind of fell in the same victim as what the Galaxy are in, where they were so hot in Phase 1 of the schedule, but then it just kind of unraveled after that, and it unraveled so much that they now find themselves in a really bad position, where even though it looked like they're still could catch some of the team that is above the red line, the schedule is definitely going to tell them otherwise, and really kind of against them for these last couple of games. But that being said, I am now going to be switching the boards for the very last time to look at the very last game of this week's action, which is the playoff 6-pointer between the San Jose Earthquakes and RSL. So, like I said, this is a playoff 6-pointer between the San Jose Earthquakes versus RSL, as the Quakes have a 6-6-8 record and RSL have a 5-7-7 record. This game kicks off at 10:30 p.m. Eastern, 7:30 p.m. Pacific, and the reason why this is a playoff 6-pointer is that both of these teams are on the bubble of the playoff line, with the Quakes are currently the last team above the red line in the West with a 2-point lead over RSL, who is currently in 9th place and just below that. And the remaining game for both of these teams, for the Quakes, they got LAFC at home, which is going to be the last home game of this regular season. Then they, of course, will have to play against the Sounders on the road on decision day. Now, for RSL, they're going to have to go on the road in the next game against the Galaxy, and then after that, they, of course, are going to be playing against Sporting KC at home on decision day, which, fun fact for you, that's actually the same matchup that they, of course, had on decision day back in 2017, and we can all remember, at least I can always remember that 2017 decision day where the Quakes literally scored a stoppage time winner to basically made it to the playoffs, and that broke both FC Dallas and RSL hearts, with both of them winning on decision day, but it didn't really matter either way, because for the Quakes, they were in the driving seat and they got the job done, albeit in the very last minute to snatch the last spot in the playoffs. So maybe this could be something similar to that, although the difference is the Quakes are playing against the Sounders on the road for decision day. And if you want to ask me who really need these 3 points in this playoff 6-pointer, it's got to be the Quakes. I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever that this is an absolute must-win for the Quakes. And I'm even going to say it. If they do not win this game, they're done. They're done in terms of the playoffs, because I don't see how in the world they're going to get points against a red-hot LAFC team in the next one at home. And I don't see how they're going to be going to the Sounders to get points in that game after they, of course, lost 7-1 the last time they went up to CenturyLink Field to face against the Seattle Sounders. And that, the RSL does have a much favorable last 2 games, with the likes of going on the road against a struggling Galaxy team and playing at home against SKC, who might be the top team in the Western Conference, but that might be a game where they might rest some of their starters heading into the playoffs. So, yeah, overall, this is a must-win for the Quakes, in that if they do not get anything but 3 points in this game, I really think they're done in terms of making the playoffs, and that it's going to be so disappointing that this is now the second year in a row where the Quakes were in such a good position of making the playoffs, and yet they once again let their fans down by collapsing late in the season. So hopefully that won't be the case, but I'm a Quakes fan that have low expectation in terms of the team, but even still, I can see how much this game really means to the Quakes, and that the playoff hope really falls into this game, even though this is technically not the last game of the season. But either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash the subscribe button. As always, let me know in the comments below your prediction for all 13 of these games that hopefully will be played in this midweek action around MLS. But until then, hope you guys enjoy this video, and I will see you guys next time.